In the summer of 2007, Israel began a near-total blockade of the Gaza Strip. The flow of goods and people into and out of Gaza was severely restricted for several years. This wasn't the first time that Gaza was cut off from the outside world, but it would become its longest and most extreme period of closure and would have a deep impact on the future of Gaza. This video will cover the blockade of Gaza and its profound economic and humanitarian effects. Most of the information for this video comes from reports by the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. These and other sources can be found through the link in the description. In 1987, 20 years after Israel took control of the West Bank and Gaza, conflict broke out between Israel and the Palestinian people. The Palestinian territories had been under Israeli control since the 6 Days War and were governed by a military administration. Discontent among Palestinians erupted into a period of protests and riots against Israeli occupation. This was known as the First Intifada and lasted from 1987 to 1993. In response to the uprising, Israel enacted numerous restrictions which had a major impact on the Palestinian economy. A new system of ID requirements was set up, which along with the creation of many checkpoints and frequent curfews, made the movement of people and goods much more difficult. In the agricultural sector, one of Palestine's most important, prohibitions on harvesting and selling produce, along with the destruction of tens of thousands of trees and other crops by Israel, led to losses of over 40%. Other industries also suffered, as Israel made it more difficult for businesses to obtain permits and licenses, and restrictions on transporting goods hindered trade. As a result of these restrictions, Palestinian exports fell by over a third from 1987 to 1990, and the per capita GNP of Palestine declined by around 40%. Despite this economic damage, the conflict did have a positive effect in that it led to a serious effort to reach a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. In 1993, the Oslo Accords were signed by Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which established a framework for peace and the creation of an independent Palestinian state. The process was to take 5 years and involve additional negotiations. The newly created Palestinian Authority would gradually be given control over the Palestinian territories. This brought an end to the First Intifada, and between 1994 and 2000, the Palestinian economy began to recover. Unfortunately, the peace process encountered a number of challenges. In 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was a key leader in creating the peace plan, was assassinated by an Israeli extremist who was opposed to it. This, along with other issues and disagreements in negotiations, meant that little progress was made. By 2000, it was clear that the peace process was stalled and tensions were on the rise again. In September 2000, Israeli politician and former general Ariel Sharon, who would soon be the Prime Minister of Israel, made a provocative visit to the Muslim holy site at Al-Aqsa, accompanied by hundreds of security guards. This caused outrage among Palestinians and sparked the beginning of the Second Intifada. Israel again responded by greatly increasing restrictions on Palestinians and the Palestinian economy. As a result, unemployment increased from around 10% in 2000 to over 30% in 2002. The poverty rate more than doubled, reaching over 60%. The situation was especially bad in Gaza, where unemployment was close to 40% and the poverty rate reached 80%. In addition, food consumption declined by over 25%, and rates of malnutrition increased. In Gaza, around 13% of children under the age of 5 suffered from acute malnutrition, and in the West Bank, around 4% did. Conditions were worse in Gaza in part because around 70% of Gazans were refugees. They had previously been forced to flee from places in what is now Israel or the West Bank, losing their homes and jobs, and as a result, having a much lower economic status. Most of the economic harm took place in the first few years of the start of the crisis, after which there was some recovery, but much of the economic destruction that had taken place persisted. In 2005, Israel announced and carried out a full withdrawal of military forces and Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip. There was hope that this could be a step towards Palestinian independence. Key Palestinian issues since the 1990s had been starting construction on a seaport in Gaza, putting Gaza's airport into service, and establishing a permanent connection by bus between Gaza and the West Bank. Israel had previously made commitments on these issues, but had failed to fulfill its promises. Calls were again made for progress on these issues following Israel's withdrawal, but again no progress was made. In January of 2006, elections were held for the Palestinian Legislative Council that would prove to be deeply consequential. The main factions contesting this election were Fatah and Hamas. Fatah was the party that had negotiated with Israel to reach the Oslo Accords, and was the more moderate faction. Hamas, on the other hand, pushed a strategy of armed resistance against Israel, and was considered a terrorist organization by Israel and the United States. Contrary to expectations, Hamas won the election with just under 45% of the vote, compared to 41% for Fatah. Following the elections, Israel again increased restrictions on Gaza and the West Bank, and withheld tax revenues from the Palestinian Authority. In addition, many countries that had been financially supporting the Palestinian Authority halted their support. After 5 years of restrictions during the Second Intifada, from 2000 to 2005, the economy of Palestine was severely damaged. Its GDP in 2005 was 10% lower than it was in 1999, and GDP per capita was almost 30% lower. Unemployment was at 24%, and poverty at 44%, around twice what they were in 1999. Conditions were even worse in Gaza, and as a result of the additional restrictions that were imposed following Hamas's electoral win, Gaza's economy declined further. Per capita GDP fell by over 15% from 2005 to 2006. In addition, unemployment rose from 30% to around 35%. This was only the beginning for Gaza, however, as in 2007 the situation deteriorated further. In June of 2007, hostilities between Hamas and Fatah erupted into a series of violent clashes. The outcome of this fighting was that Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. In response to this, Israel began a full blockade of Gaza. With Hamas taking control of Gaza, Israel tightened restrictions on the Gaza Strip to their highest level ever, beginning a near-total blockade. All access into Gaza was effectively controlled by Israel. Gaza's airport, which had been built in 1998, was destroyed in 2002. In addition, Israel maintained an exclusion zone around Gaza's coastline. The only points of entry were through land crossings along Gaza's borders. All of these crossings were controlled by Israel, except for those on Gaza's southern border, which were managed by Egypt, but in close cooperation with Israel. The key components of the blockade were restrictions on the movement of people and goods. The Erez crossing had been the main crossing for people into and out of Gaza. Gazans had in the past left the Strip for Israel and the West Bank to attend school, for work, to visit family, and for health care. Restrictions during the early 2000s had reduced this activity, and with the blockade, practically all transit of people ended. The Karnai crossing had been the main crossing for goods coming into the Strip, and was the only crossing for exports. It was frequently shut down for days or weeks at a time prior to the blockade. After the blockade began, the Karnai crossing was shut down to truck traffic, and only a conveyor belt for grain, animal feed, and construction materials remained in use. In its place, the smaller Kerem Shalom crossing became the main crossing for goods. The Karnai crossing, which had been in the north of Gaza, was only 5 kilometers from Gaza City, the main population center, and location of most of Gaza's factories and storage facilities. Kerem Shalom, on the other hand, was in the far south, distant from most important destinations within Gaza, and also from those within Israel, such as Mediterranean ports and crossings into the West Bank. This change significantly increased the costs of transportation for both imports and exports. It has continued to be a problem, as Kerem Shalom has remained the main crossing. With the beginning of the blockade, imports into Gaza were severely restricted. At Kerem Shalom, imports dropped by about 80%. The daily average of truckloads allowed into Gaza before the blockade was around 500. In 2008, it dropped to around 100. The overall quantity of goods allowed to enter was restricted, as were the specific types of goods. Items that were considered luxuries, such as paper, toys, spices, chocolate, and coffee, were banned. Clothes and shoes were also banned. Almost all goods were banned except for basic food and hygiene products. Food imports were limited to 18 specific items. Israeli officials calculated the minimum amount of calories required for survival and apparently set restrictions based on this. They spoke of keeping Gaza's economy alive, but just on the edge of crisis. The rules guiding what items were banned and what restrictions were in place were not clearly stated, which caused significant confusion and added to the difficulty of bringing goods into Gaza. Materials needed for construction, industry, and manufacturing were also banned, which damaged Gaza's productive sectors that relied on these imports and led to an increase in unemployment. In addition, exports from Gaza were almost completely prohibited. In the first half of 2007, over 1,000 truckloads of goods were exported per month. In the second half of 2007, and over the next few years, the monthly average was under 15. This further added to the deterioration of Gaza's economy and a rise in unemployment, as export-dependent industries lost access to their markets. Two key examples of this were the textile and furniture industries, which were both important sectors of the economy. They were forced to mostly shut down as they lost access to their markets, and as a result, tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. Over 90% of industry shut down following the start of the blockade. There had been around 3,900 factories in Gaza that employed 35,000 people. This was reduced to 195 factories, employing under 2,000. The agricultural sector also suffered. Around 40,000 workers who relied on selling cash crops lost their income, as around 85% of goods grown in Gaza had been exported. In addition, in 2009, Israel extended the size of its buffer zone along the border from 22 meters to 300 meters. This meant that over a third of Gaza's farmland was now off-limits. This added to the over 100,000 square miles of agricultural land and close to 500,000 trees that were destroyed in the West Bank and Gaza in the early 2000s. In Beit Hanun in Gaza's northeast, over 50% of the agricultural land of mostly fruit and olive trees had been destroyed. Israel's ban on the import of seeds during the blockade further hindered the agricultural sector. The fishing industry also experienced serious losses, as the area available to fishermen along Gaza's coast was greatly reduced. Employment in the fishing industry fell by over 60% compared to 2000. Another important effect of the blockade was the damage to Gaza's infrastructure and essential services. Much of Gaza's infrastructure, including hospitals, the public water system, the sewage system, and the electrical grid, sustained damage during the blockade and in the years after as a result of Israeli bombing campaigns and military operations. This damage was greatly enhanced by the fact that replacement parts needed for repairs were often banned or had very long delays in being imported. This meant that it would often take years for things to be repaired, if they were repaired at all. Gaza's only power plant was bombed in 2006 and was at limited capacity even after repairs. On top of this, as part of the blockade, Israel limited the amount of fuel allowed into Gaza. Because of this, not enough power was able to be produced, and rolling blackouts had to be put in place. Hospitals struggled to keep essential equipment working, which reduced their ability to provide basic healthcare services. They experienced power cuts for 8 to 12 hours a day. Hospitals were also at critical levels in their supply of essential drugs due to import restrictions. Damage to Gaza's sewage system, along with the limited supply of power, meant that it could not function properly. Sewage had to be emptied into the Mediterranean with little or no treatment as a result. These factors contributed to serious sanitation problems. Access to clean drinking water was also greatly reduced. Damage to water infrastructure and lack of electricity meant that water wells and pumping stations fell into disrepair. In 2000, around 98% of Gazans had access to safe drinking water through public water networks. This would be reduced to only 10% by 2018. Gaza's access to safe drinking water declined to become one of the worst in the world. A report from the World Health Organization in 2008 estimated that as much as 26% of the diseases in Gaza were related to unclean water. With the public water system having deteriorated, Gazans came to rely on more expensive alternatives for obtaining water, such as bottled water or having water delivered by truck. This added to the serious economic strain on Gazans. Throughout both the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians spent around 8% of their monthly expenditure on water, much higher than the global average of around 3.5%. The impact of the blockade, along with the closures and restrictions that had been in place in the years before, devastated the economy of Gaza. Real GDP per capita had fallen by around 40% compared to what it was in 1999. Unemployment increased from around 15% in 1999 to 30% before the blockade, and over 40% by 2008. As a result, around 80% of families had come to rely on aid, an increase from 63% in 2006 and around 10 times more people than a decade earlier. The number of people living below the poverty line increased to over 80%, and food insecurity increased to 56%. Health conditions also worsened. The infant mortality rate in Gaza had steadily declined for decades, but this trend came to an end, and the rate remained roughly the same between 2006 and 2013. Infant mortality rates were much higher in Gaza at 25 per 1,000 compared to the West Bank, where the rate was 15 per 1,000. Maternal mortality rates were also much higher, being 37 per 100,000 compared to 8 in the West Bank. The deteriorating conditions in Gaza created international pressure on Israel to end the blockade. In May 2010, a group of activists led several ships loaded with humanitarian supplies toward Gaza in an attempt to deliver aid. When the ships were raided by Israeli forces and 9 of the activists were killed, there was strong international condemnation. This event greatly heightened the pressure on Israel and pushed them to make the decision to finally ease restrictions on Gaza. Most exports were still banned, and Gazans were still mostly prohibited from leaving the Strip, but more types of items were allowed in, and the amount of imports increased. Over 3,000 truckloads of goods entered Gaza in 2010, a significant increase from 2009. However, this was still much lower than the monthly average of over 12,000 before the blockade. Israel published a list of which items were banned. Many more types of items were allowed in, but many items remained restricted. In particular, items that Israel considered to be dual use were prohibited. These included construction materials such as cement and wooden planks, which Israel believed could be used by Hamas to construct tunnels. Restrictions on these items greatly slowed construction and reconstruction efforts. Gaza's GDP improved somewhat in 2010 and 2011 following the easing of restrictions. Unemployment dropped from 38% in 2010 to 29% in 2011. This boost to the economy, however, was only temporary. The damage that the economy had sustained over the past several years, along with the continuation of many key restrictions, ensured that the economy would only get worse in the years ahead. The period from 2007 to 2010 was the most intense phase of restrictions on Gaza. While there was some easing of restrictions in 2010, many important restrictions remained in place and contributed to the further deterioration of Gaza's economy. Gaza's economy saw some improvement immediately after restrictions were eased, but following a major Israeli military operation in 2014, GDP per capita dropped and then continued to decline. Between 2012 and 2022, GDP per capita fell by about 35%. Compared to 1999, Gaza's GDP per capita was about cut in half. Economic activity continued to be severely limited. The manufacturing sector had declined by close to 60% between 1994 and 2012. After somewhat recovering following the blockade, it continued to decline both in terms of output and as a percentage of GDP. Trade also continued to be limited, as many export restrictions remained in place. Only in 2014 did Israel begin to allow a small number of items to be exported, mostly agricultural products. Even after this, exports were only about 1/5 of what they were before the blockade. As a result of this economic stagnation, levels of unemployment increased. The unemployment rate rose from 29% in 2011 to over 50% by 2018, higher than its peak of around 40% during the height of the blockade. It remained at around 50% over the next several years. Youth unemployment was especially high. Around 70% of college graduates between 19 and 29 were unemployed. Gaza came to have the highest unemployment rate of any country in the world. Poverty also increased. From 2011 to 2017, the poverty rate increased by around 15%. The number of people in deep poverty also increased, rising from 21 to over 34%. In the following years, poverty continued to increase, rising from 43% to nearly 60% in 2021. Food insecurity increased as well, rising from around 47% in 2014 to 64% in 2022. The weak state of the economy and its inability to grow and become self-sustaining meant that Gaza became almost completely reliant on external aid. Around 80,000 people were receiving food assistance from UNRWA in 2000. This increased to over 1 million by 2022. Overall, around 80% of Gazans were dependent on aid. Comparing Gaza to the West Bank shows how severely the blockade devastated the economy. Gaza and the West Bank would have been expected to have a similar performance over these years, but beginning around 2006, Gaza's economy rapidly declined. Prior to the blockade, Gaza made up around 35% of the GDP of Palestine. As Gaza's economy declined, this was reduced to only 18%. Compared to most other economies in the world, Gaza's growth has been incredibly slow. Its average annual growth from 1994 to 2021 was 1%, much less than the average of 3.5% for other low-income countries. In addition to a weak economy, Gaza's infrastructure continued to be in a state of disrepair. Lack of power meant that there continued to be regular blackouts. The water and sewage systems also remained dysfunctional. Gaza's coastal aquifer, which is its main water source, was contaminated by sewage and the inflow of seawater due to years of overuse. Over 95% of the aquifer is below standards for human consumption. Gazans were forced to rely on treated water from private vendors, but much of this was still polluted. Much of the damage to Gaza's infrastructure is a result of Israeli military operations. There were major operations in 2008, 2012, and in 2014. The 2014 operation was the largest one yet. It lasted for around 50 days, during which time there were close to 10,000 air and missile strikes, and close to 20,000 artillery and tank shells were fired. This resulted in damage to agricultural land, the water system, the power grid, factories, schools, healthcare facilities, and housing. Much of this damage, like the damage from previous conflicts, lasted for years afterwards. The Palestinian death toll that year was the highest since Israel began its occupation in 1967. Over 2,000 people were killed and 17,000 injured. More than 12,000 housing units were destroyed, and over 160,000 were damaged. The close to 100,000 Gazans who were made homeless as a result added to the already difficult housing situation that Gaza was facing as a result of restrictions on construction materials and a growing population. Although many homes were rebuilt in the following years, by 2018, Gaza still had a housing shortage of as many as 100,000 units. Thousands of families were still displaced when in 2021, Israel launched another major offensive in which an additional 1,600 homes were destroyed, thousands more were damaged, and around 10,000 people were injured. Gaza's healthcare system was also under severe stress. Lack of power continued to be a major problem, and there were chronic shortages of medicine and hospital supplies. Replacement parts for essential equipment would often take months to be imported. Gazans struggled to pay for primary health care and frequently turned to humanitarian facilities, but these were often overburdened and unable to provide proper care because of insufficient funding. The healthcare system was especially strained in 2018 and 2019, when over 30,000 people were injured, around one-fifth of them by live Israeli fire, during a mass protest movement. Around 200 people were also killed. Tens of thousands of Gazans gathered at the border wall to protest the blockade and demand the right to return to the homes that they had been displaced from. Under these difficult conditions of a stagnant economy, high poverty, and destroyed infrastructure, troubling health trends emerged. The rising poverty rate in the late 2010s directly impacted the ability of families to obtain food. Doctors and healthcare facilities began reporting higher rates of malnutrition, especially among children. In some of the worst areas of Gaza, only around 14% of children under 5 years of age had a minimum acceptable diet. In addition, around 18% of pregnant women were malnourished, and 40% were anemic from lack of key micronutrients. Among children under 5, rates of being underweight and of stunting increased significantly from 2014 to 2020. Around 9% of children under 5 were stunted, meaning they were significantly below average height for their age. Stunting is a key symptom of chronic malnutrition, which is what most children were suffering from. Chronic malnutrition is the result of a long-term situation of not having enough food. It is especially damaging in children because it has lasting, irreversible effects on cognitive and physical health. The number of children who had to be treated multiple times for chronic malnutrition increased, and levels of acute malnutrition also increased. Why did Israel enact this policy of extreme economic restrictions? In the early phase of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, many restrictions that were put in place served a legitimate purpose for security. There were attacks by militants against Israeli forces and citizens, and restrictions were meant to prevent these attacks. There were other restrictions that were excessive and were likely more about retribution, but it could be argued that security was still the main focus of restrictions. By the early 2000s, while security concerns continued to play a role, many restrictions moved well beyond security. A top advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister in 2006 is reported to have said that the idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. Documents released after the blockade further highlighted this thinking, as Israel told the U.S. in 2008 that it would push the economy of Gaza to the edge, but avoid a full humanitarian crisis. That the closure policy was about much more than security is further made clear by the severity of restrictions. Limitations on the types and quantities of food, the banning of toys and paper, restrictions on imports of medicine, and preventing the repair of essential water and energy infrastructure are clearly not about security. The severity of these actions suggests that the motivation behind them was at least in part as a form of revenge or collective punishment. Israel's tightening of restrictions when Hamas came to power was partly a reactionary response, but it developed into a strategy aimed at removing Hamas from power. The idea was that putting economic pressure on Gazans would make them oppose Hamas, and that this would somehow lead to Hamas being removed from power. It was a strategy of economic warfare against Hamas, but also against the entire population of Gaza. Such a strategy is deeply immoral because it embraces the idea that it is acceptable to punish an entire group of people for the actions of a few. It is even worse when considering that at the start of the blockade, and throughout this whole period, over 50% of the population of Gaza was under the age of 18. As Gaza's population is young and growing, the majority of people who have suffered under these restrictions have been children. By 2010, it was clear that this strategy had failed. Instead of being weakened, Hamas had become entrenched. The economic closure led to the creation of a tunnel network across the Egyptian border through which large quantities of goods were brought into Gaza. This activity was controlled by Hamas, which only further empowered it. The economic closures also did not stop rocket attacks from being launched against Israel. Despite the clear failure of this strategy, Israeli leaders decided to continue with a policy of restrictions. While some restrictions were eased in 2010, many were kept in place, and Gaza's economy continued to suffer and deteriorate. Maintaining the restrictions did serve a purpose in that it preserved the status quo of a weak economy and Hamas in control of Gaza. For many Israeli leaders, this was actually a good thing. In 2019, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke about how supporting Hamas in Gaza was beneficial because it would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. Other right-wing Israeli leaders have made similar comments, such as stating that Hamas was an asset. For these people, an empowered Hamas preserves the division of Palestine between Gaza and the West Bank. This ensures that any movement towards a peaceful resolution and the creation of a Palestinian state is impossible. It buys time for the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which furthers the annexation of the region by Israel. Even before the blockade, some in Israel saw the rise of Hamas as a positive thing for this reason. Over the course of Israel's closure of Gaza, a number of different motivations have been at play. There has been no single clear purpose or justification. Instead, a variety of factors have driven this policy of restrictions. legitimate security concerns have for the most part played a minor role. The remaining motivations fail to provide an acceptable justification for this policy, given the severe economic and humanitarian harm that these restrictions have brought to millions of people.